Hey, hello, hi, welcome to and or back to the EquiTheory podcast. I am your host, Jill Treese, and this podcast is about all things ponies. Aren't we all students of the horse? I'm sorry, I'll never do that again. But this episode is going to be part 2 in the positive reinforcement riding series. So originally, we broke up episode 1 into what it is and this part, and then me and Caine had planned to just kind of wrap up the end of this episode, and then there would only be 2 parts, and then we would be answering listener questions in episode 3. But as luck would have it, when you get 2 horse people talking and there's all the caveats and all the avenues to explore, it ended up being 3 hours this episode, and I'm not going to do that to you guys for listenability. And also, I think episode 3, it's possible that it could be listened to as a standalone. This episode covers a lot of things about, like, can you give treats while you're riding, or what are the steps you take as far as training, vet checks, equipment, and, you know, you need to have a horse that stands at the mounting block. We talked about that for a while. Goals for riding and how you meet those goals, how you move, how you get speed, extension, high energy movements, how do you ride correctly, and how do you get, like, you know, proper biomechanics out of the horse and yourself, you know, hind end engagement, inside leg to outside rein, that sort of thing. Common cues that Caine uses, and, you know, just really everything positive reinforcement. How do you go for any length of time? And the most commonly asked questions about riding we address in this episode. In episode 3 in this little mini series, it'll be part 2 of the, or, oh my God, it'll be positive 3. Part 3 of the positive reinforcement riding series, and part 4 will be listener questions. So after this episode goes out, then next week we will post the part that we had to cut off of this episode, if that makes any sense. So I'm pretty much just leaving this as the half of the first set we did, and then I'm going to upload the last little segment as part 3. I say last little segment, it's probably about an hour and a half long. So, you know, you got some good content coming up soon. But then after all 3 parts are up, I'm going to re-ask again on my Instagram on either EquiTheory or Jet EquiTheory or both, and have you guys ask me if you have any questions after you've listened to these episodes, and then we'll tackle those in the 4th episode, which will conclude this series, and hopefully you will feel like you have a better grasp on riding with positive reinforcement. So yeah, that's what this podcast is about. I hope that it's somewhat informative, because I get really frustrated when I listen to other trainers talk about getting a behavior and it seems very ambiguous and ethereal, and it's not like a straight, this is what I do. So hopefully this episode is a bit more like that. Obviously, this is what Caine does for a living, so I'm not expecting them to be able to just, like, give away everything they know and go exactly step by step, because that is how we make living, you know? And just because I choose to do that does not mean everybody does, or that it's the wisest business decision, you know? But I really am excited to have Caine on this episode. I think it's a really good talk and conversation. I hope that you guys feel similarly. And be sure to let me know. And if any thoughts or questions come up, feel free to shoot them to the EquiTheory Instagram or email, and I will get back to you. Can't promise Jet EquiTheory Instagram. That one is a bit difficult for me to get back to DMs. But, you know, if you have a question and you don't want to lose it, or you're afraid you might miss the question post, go ahead and shoot it to me in DM, and I will try to include it if I find it's applicable. We're also going to be doing another episode on problem horses in the near future. I don't know when that'll be. I'll probably take a break with Caine episodes after this series, so I can get to some of the Patron questions. I've got a lot of good ones lined up, and I'm really excited to talk about them, but I can't squeeze it into a Caine episode, because holy shit, we have so much to talk about, okay? So anyway, I'm going to wrap up this intro. Let's roll the music and get into this bad boy, okay? I'm not wasting your time, because you got a long episode ahead of you. All right, let's go. Alrighty, Alrighty, guys, you know the drill. We have got to do the Patron ad because Jill still has not found sponsors for the podcast. There's been a lot going on. Whatever. It's fine. Listen to the Patron ad, and then we'll get into it. Okay, 3, 2, 1, go. So the last ad before we jump into the content is one where you can support me and the horses directly. If you're willing and able, check us out at EquiTheory on your Patreon app or at patreon.com/EquiTheory. When you become a patron of the podcast, you can ask me questions that I'll answer on the podcast for just $5 a month. And at the $10 tier, you can receive merch and have access to live Q&A events, which means you get your questions answered in real time. And at the higher tiers, you have the option for phone call consults with me on air or privately, as well as access to online training with me depending on your tier. Sounds like a lot of fun to me. But lastly, you should know, should you decide to become a patron, you can cancel at any time or subscribe and unsubscribe as you please or as you're able. And if you can't support us through Patreon, no worries at all whatsoever. Listening alone is more than enough. I just want to say thank you to all the current and future patrons. Me and the ponies appreciate it endlessly. But anyway, I'm going to stop talking and we're going to get into the part where I talk about things that you're actually interested in. Okay, so actually getting to the riding portion now. When you start riding, when you're starting to think about entering all of the steps that it takes, what are those puzzle pieces that you need to have in place before you even go about getting on your horse? You don't have to necessarily break down each behavior. That doesn't have to be this episode because we're running out of time. But what do you do before? So I have some things to consider written down. What training skills do you have in place in the horse's repertoire? What are your protocols for vet checks, equipment fitting, and things in that realm? Because there's a lot that goes into riding.
I have such a simple answer for this. I tell this to all my clients. When you want to take the next step, you have to immediately think, before you even think about training it, before you think about performing it, you have to think, do I know how my horse is going to react to this?
Yeah.
If you don't, then you've probably missed a step somewhere. You need to go back. If you do, then you can start thinking about how you're going to present that training. And then, with how you present it, then how your horse will continuously react. Only then, if you can answer all those questions and so perfectly predict your horse, then you can start training it. We especially went through that with Uma because she is a deaf Mustang. She can't hear. So we had to cover all of our bases.
Mm-hmm.
Nova as well. Nova being as reactive and sensitive as he was. If I skipped a step or didn't think of a step, that's my fault, and I am guaranteed going to get heavily injured for it. I'm going to pay that price.
Yeah, so and I think that's actually
my quick answer to that is predict your horse, know your horse. You have to answer every single question. You have to fill every single hole.
Right, and I think that is a beautifully simple yet massively complex answer because it encompasses everything. If you don't know how your horse is going to react to a certain girth, then, you don't need to be riding. And
by those reactions, you need to be avoiding fireworks. I didn't have a single firework with Nova, not a single one, because I was so slow. I was so slow. It took me a year to get him to where he is now. He's been started under saddle for a little over a year now. It took me 2 months to even sit on him,
Right.
Be slow, be really, really meticulous.
And I think that's very reminiscent of Mac, my retired racehorse project that ended up not going. I ended up pulling him from that competition because I didn't know. I was like, he's going to be, well, actually I did know, but I didn't know how to get there because I was like, there are so many pieces to this. He's going to be so overwhelmed. He will not be ready in 9 months, and we were like 6 months out from the competition. And I was like, I am not even riding him yet. We had so much groundwork to do that it just wasn't even within our wheelhouse. And also I'm still very new to this in the grand scheme of things. So, I've not had all the experience that I would need to be able to go at a quick rate. And it's also entirely dependent on the horse as well. And those two things, it might make it go slower being inexperienced as well as having a horse that has a lot of baggage and some things that need to be covered. So I would definitely say, from my perspective, the things to do before you go to get on would be to have your horse vet checked. Very common issues are ulcers and kissing spine. They are rampant in the horse world. In the research that I have done on both of those things, it seems that most horses have them, though kissing spine doesn't always create pain, but that's another episode. but making sure that you're not going to be fighting against any pain issues, because you will not be able to train through pain. In the example with me and Zoe, I tried to counter condition my leg and it didn't work because she was in pain. It wasn't my training was bad. It was because I couldn't be more reinforcing than the pain, nor do I want to be. I don't want her to have to work through things that hurt. I want her to feel good and be physically capable of doing what I'm asking her. And on that topic, equipment comes into play as well. If you have a girthy horse, you need to either change your girth, find what girth your horse likes, figure out what's bothering them, make sure they're seen by a chiropractor or a physio, make sure you've checked for ulcers, things like that, just so you're setting yourself up for success and you're not trying to work against discomfort, because if the horse isn't comfortable, it's not going to be a pleasant experience for them. And riding is just as much about the horse as it is about the rider. You have a saddle that's perfectly fitted to you or that was convenient for you to buy. And then, I mean, does your horse pay the price? Let's hope not. Those are really important things to consider.
And on that note, too, on the comfort is, happiness is just as important as well. Most of my first experiences, again, were just with Lily. Lily's very introverted, and Lily, most of the time, if she's expressing an emotion, it's anger. So she doesn't have a wide variety of emotions to the naked eye or to outsiders. But Nova really made me appreciate that and how much happiness plays a role in it, because when he made that transition into like shut down and shut off and wanting nothing to do with humans to like, oh my God, everything is fun. Everything was fun. And it was really obvious when he wasn't enjoying something. And then it was like, why am I teaching this if he's not enjoying this? Or how can I teach this in a way that he does enjoy it? Everything was a game with him, and it really paid off. But also, to make this answer brief, I only have one more note on my draft. Also, the horse's physical attributes and limitations. I have to consider that a lot, especially if I have goals for that horse or plans for that horse. Conformation plays a really big part. So Nova's hind legs are, I swear, a foot too long for his body. He also has a very long back and neck and very low set forelocks. I knew because of that he would not be fit for jumping.
Fetlocks?
Fetlocks, sorry, thank you.
I just caught that. I was like, that doesn't sound right for some reason.
I wrote 4 fetlocks. Okay, so his front fetlocks.
Yeah.
Because of that, I knew he wouldn't be fit for jumping, but also he just straight up said, no, thank you, I don't want to jump, it's not for me.
Yeah.
So because of his conformation, his training focuses on sitting back and slowing down and keeping those ridiculously long hind legs underneath him and rhythm and emphasis on impulsion and lift and collection, things that are going to help the weaknesses in his body.
Right.
In contrast, I have a quarter horse mare who's very large body. Her name is Snowy. She has a long body. Like I said, she has a very large body, but she also has heavily scarred legs. She is a rescue. So movement is difficult for her. So we do just very short bursts. If I were to really focus on movement with her and her training, then that's just going to be difficult for everything. It's going to be physically difficult and mentally difficult. And it's probably just going to bring up PTSD or even just bring out pain with how scarred her legs are. So short bursts, think about your horse's conformation, what your horse enjoys, and take it to heart.
Yeah, and that reminds me, what you said about Nova makes me really think about Zoe's hocks. She gave us so many indications that something about the way we were teaching her to move was problematic. When she raced, she curbed both of her hocks, meaning, I forget the name of the tendon. It's one of the tendons on the outside of the hock, like nearest the very back of her. And she curbed both of them, which means essentially kind of like bowed it. And then she did it again on, I think, her right hind. And so one might say her hocks are not necessarily her strongest conformational attribute. She also has very long upright hind legs, and she's over at the knee in the front and has a very short back, so that puts a lot of strain on her hind end. And if she isn't reaching over her back and engaging her hind end in a balanced way, then we're putting unnecessary strain on her. So I think it's really important, like you said, to modify the way you're training and your goals and expectations to what your horse can physically do. If you're seeing a recurrent injury like Zoe and her hocks, they've been injected recently as well, because she was starting to become mildly arthritic in them and she's 9. She's a 9-year-old. Like,
she's younger than all my horses.
Yeah, and she is nearly arthritic in her hocks because of poor training and not teaching her how to use them correctly. So if she's inverted and she's not engaging her hind end, she's putting a lot of unnecessary stress on those tendons by having her feet out behind her, essentially, and not tracking up. So, which you would think it would be the reverse, but carrying herself balanced in the way that her body is designed, then that would make it better, but she was never taught how. And it's not necessarily an intuitive process to the horse, due to proprioception, training can override that, and pain and scarring, tension, all of those things in the fascia can also tell the body that it's doing something that is right when it's not. But that's a very convoluted way of saying that. But all that to say, if you're seeing a recurrent issue, it's probably time to reevaluate what's going on before proceeding. I don't know if that made any sense at all, but it sounded...
No, that makes sense.
Okay. Okay, so next question here is, in order to ride, you have to get on. So, which requires a horse that'll stand at the mounting block. So how do you train mounting? And have you encountered horses that refuse to stand at the mounting block? And what do you do?
Okay, let's be honest. I'm really tiny and I'm very short. I'm 5 feet tall, and I work with Arabs. They're on the smaller side, but I get plenty of larger horses, and my boss's horses are all gigantic warmbloods.
Right.
But to the point, if I'm riding a horse for the first time, I want to be in a saddle that fits me. Usually that's my dressage saddle because it's secure and I prefer a long leg. Or actually most often I use my Western saddle because I want to mount from the ground, especially if it is a nervous, reactive, or just started horse.
Wildly controversial opinion, especially from somebody who has an injured backed horse.
That's what I was going to say next is don't jump down my throat. I am very aware of how dangerous and whatever word I'm looking for, but bad it is to mount from the ground. But here's my reasoning.
Okay.
I can put my foot in the stirrup and start with just that. How does the horse react to just the foot in the stirrup? I can progress that to bouncing up and down, and then bouncing with a little bit of weight in that stirrup, and then pushing up because I'm pretty flexible and I'm pretty agile. So mounting from the ground is very simple and easy for me. And, again, I'm really small. I don't weigh as much.
Right. I was going to say...
can be bad for your horse's back.
Yeah, I was going to say that would not... I don't think that would work for me because I'm 5'8". And though flexible and I can get on just about anything from the ground, it requires a lot of pull on their backs. And one advantage I see to using a mounting block especially, and it has been my plan, and I'm incorporating it in very sneaky ways that they don't notice, is sometimes I'll work with our horses while I'm sitting on the fence so they get used to me being above them. And then that's not a scary thing anymore. But just for me, I'm so large and tall, I will pull over the saddle, and especially I'm particularly sensitive to back issues, of course, because of the kissing spine thing. But
no, you're right, because even me, it's still 100 pounds, and it's still 100 pounds coming up all the way from the ground.
Right.
But the reason for that being is they can feel me from the ground up. And like I said, I always do this with nervous, reactive, just started horses. If the horse is already started or calmer, then, that's a different story. I'm probably going to use a mounting block. Mm-hmm. But with my line of work, this is safety. And that's what has to be most important. Safety first.
It seems so counterintuitive to me. That's so interesting that works better. But I can see how that would make a lot of sense, because when you are on one side and you're pulling the saddle over, that's a lot of movement up on the horse's back that almost mimics you being on their backs. And then they get used to that, notice it's not a bad thing. And also, I'm assuming this isn't something that you do long term all the time. So you fade it out. So potentially mitigating, because I don't think if you mount from the ground like 8 times, you're going to damage the horse's back. You might, but I would venture to say probably not. If you do it for the duration of the time that you ride the horse over many years, yes.
No, definitely. You have to fade it out. But that's also what I mean by, if it's a lot of movement, it's a lot of weight. So that's what I mean by it has to start with how the horse just reacts to the foot in the stirrup. Because then, it progresses all the way up to me having one foot in the stirrup and completely standing on one side of the saddle. I'll even, for some horses, ask for a walk, but with just myself on one side of the saddle before even swinging my leg over. But even just the standing on the saddle, I'll do it multiple times before ever thinking of swinging my leg over.
And again, that goes back
always,
to
like pat and pet on the other side, dangle my leg, swing it, swish it, like make a little jiggle. And it's like I said before, is you have to cover all your bases. You have to fill all your holes.
That's what I was about to say.
Yeah.
Because I mean, that would not, I mean, in the traditional sense, I know a lot of people, particularly on TikTok, for some reason, I'm so glad I deleted that app. I hated seeing it. But people would break in young horses by starting there. And I think it is really, really important to caveat your explanation with saying that you prep the horses all the way up into this point, just like you did with teaching something as simple as moving off of quote unquote leg pressure. You teach that cue first. So the horse is well prepared. He knows what to expect. He knows what's going to come. And so none of this it should never be a surprise. You should never get on a horse if you don't know if they're going to buck or not. Of course, there's always the possibility.
I'm not expecting that, I dangle my leg and the horse reacts to it. And so I just keep dangling my leg to get him used to it. That's not what I want. If I dangle my leg and the horse reacts, I have to go back to the previous step.
And that is the difference. And I'm glad you clarified that, because I was getting a little nervous. I was like, whoa. I wasn't expecting you to say that.
Actually, the most important thing that I've ever learned was feel their right side. We do everything on the left side. We can trace it all the way back to when we first started riding horses. We kept our swords on our left hip because most people were right-handed. So that's why you mount from the left side.
Most people don't know that.
A lot of horses are not familiar with people handling their right side. Nova especially, again, I can't even emphasize how reactive and sensitive he was. He literally wouldn't let you go to his right side.
Zoe's very much like that too. Yeah, Zoe's like that too. I noticed that when I was working with her on Wednesday, was that I just, for some reason, like I was training her to pick up her foot on the left side, and then when I went to the right side, she kept blocking me with her head. And so I had to go back a step, because I was like, there's a reason she's blocking me. She's not comfortable. She doesn't understand something. So instead of just pushing the issue and waiting her out until she stopped doing it, I went back a step and reinforced her for standing still, and then me going a little wider and a little wider, and then a little further back and a little further back until I could walk all the way around her both directions. And we've done this before, but in having some time off, she needed a refresher. But I think that's the very important difference, that when something starts going wrong, you don't just go, okay, deal with it, horse, get over it. It's not scary. You're like, okay, something isn't making sense to you. Let's find the hole and fill it. So then we have a solid foundation.
If your horse is going to flinch away from you touching his right side, then don't even think about swinging your leg over.
Right.
And even in that way too, I mounted Nova from the right side almost 100%. I almost never mounted from the left side because of his reactions.
Right. And I was going to say earlier when we were talking about mounting from the ground, and then I was going to mention mounting from both sides to balance out the pull a little bit. But I was like, nobody does that anyway. And I nixed it, and I should have said it now, because that makes a lot of sense. Every behavior that you train on one side, you should train on the other side. People that have started training their horses manners or target training, you find this a lot, that when you train it on one side, you're like, okay, they've got it. Let me switch sides. And then they're like, what are we doing? And they're like, I'm supposed to turn my head to the left. You're in the left now. I'm doing the right behavior. Why isn't this working? But you have to teach it on both sides so that it makes sense to the horse and they're comfortable with it on both sides. I think that's a really good point.
Well, and then for the question, what do you do if your horse keeps moving away from the block? I actually teach that. My horses know that if they move away, it's a recognition of no, or I'm not ready. It's the same if they return to the block after I've mounted them, or if they return to the gate. They want me to dismount, so I do. They don't necessarily get a treat from it, but they do get me dismounting, and a lot of times just ending the session. It's something that they asked, and if they're not ready, then they're not ready. If the horse is adamantly returning to the block or moving away from the block, you need to think about other things. And most of the time that means don't ride, do other groundwork and do other things that will help that, because obviously riding is too much of a stress. You can try moving the block to a different area, but I usually would just, again, go back to groundwork, work on more forward movements and addressing other underlying anxieties, do things that have absolutely nothing to do with that.
Yeah. And additionally, consider why your horse doesn't want you on your back from your training perspective, of course, but also, is there something going on? And that's something I wish I had started with Zoe, because she very clearly, though I probably would not have recognized it because I would have written a narrative, but taught her to give me a cue to dismount. I just did a webinar watching Fair Horsemanship, and she discussed a lot about riding. It was called Riding with the Clicker and Positive Reinforcement, which prompted me to reach out to you to do this. But she talked about a cue very similar, but something that the horses never do, so it's very hard to get confused. She would have the horse turn around and touch her foot by like holding a target stick near her foot, and then they would bump her foot and then click and treat for that. But she would click, dismount, and then treat, and then do that over and over again, so that the horse learned that touching her boot resulted in her getting off, and then they got a treat, of course. But then, if that never came up, then when the horse is riding and it's being reinforced for other behaviors, if it turns around and touches her boot, she gets off. The horse asked her to get off very clearly. It's not a mistake, like, maybe drifting to the mounting block. You could be like, well, is it drifting? Does he want me off? So I think that was a really clear thing. But I think that there's an important conversation to have here, because I can feel a lot of people's stomachs twisting on the inside at the idea of dismounting when their horse says no, because a lot of people's concern, and mine too when I first started this, was, well, if I allow my horse to say no, how will I ever ride? And my initial reaction now to that is, why are you riding in a way that your horse never wants to do anything? And
it's just power. If your horse says no and you're offended by it, that is a you problem.
Yeah, I agree. And to me, it would say now, okay, something's wrong. Either the horse is in pain, it's uncomfortable, the environment is scary, it's anxious. I need to go back a step. I need to figure out what's going on here and isolate some variables so I can see what is actually going on. Wouldn't it be a dream if they could just tell us? But in many cases, it's easier to just be like, that was an accident.
And big whoop if your horse doesn't want to ride. Riding isn't everything, especially with Plus R. You're quickly going to figure that out. There's a lot of things that are still fun about horses, and owning a horse is not about riding it.
Yeah, and I definitely fell down that rabbit hole, and that's not to say that everyone who starts with positive reinforcement will do that as well, but I mean, Zoe had her colic surgery in 2018, and she was supposed to be out for, I think, 6 weeks. And I've ridden maybe 5 times in the past 2 years, because there was so much else to work on, and I was enjoying it. And the only reason
it was fun.
Yeah, and I never ever, even when I started positive reinforcement and I dove head first, I was like, I will never be content not riding ever.
Yeah, and I thought the same thing.
And it's just not, there's so much more to appreciate and have fun with and work critically. And you can still be a disciplinarian, militant, I want to train things, and do it on the ground and have fun and enjoy it without such, rigidity. And that's not to speak against, traditional training or competition mindset, but you can still take that competitive edge to working on the ground and using positive reinforcement and really working your brain and your horse's brain in a way that is fun and enjoyable for both of you. I agree that it's totally, most of the time we spend with our horses is not on their backs. 90% of the time for most people. Some people, I guess, they don't they only ride. But I mean, I would say for the majority of us that are not super rich and have grooms to hand our horses off to, it's spent on the ground grooming and cleaning their stalls and spending time with them, and a lot of groundwork. And that is really undervalued in the traditional world. I know in dressage particularly, it seems to be a bigger deal, but in eventing, groundwork was lunging.
Well, and that goes right back to like how I said my ultimate personal goals are to ride with as few tools as possible. And so in that same light, I just love groundwork. I could do groundwork all day, every day with all of my horses because I don't need a lunge line. I don't need a whip. I just recently taught Nova his perfect, collected, impulsive walk to canter transitions without anything but my voice. It is so exciting and liberating and just awesome.
And right? I mean, the whole time I'm filming myself, and when I review the footage, it's just so starkly different than the footage of me riding. Like, I mean, you guys listening can go back and watch my older videos of me riding. There's almost never a smile on my face. And it's because I am thinking so hard about the things that are going wrong and how I can fix them and make them look pretty and nice. Whereas when I'm on the ground with Zoe working with positive reinforcement, I am laughing my ass off the entire time because she's so creative and she is so willing to learn, and it's a blast for both of us. Even though it doesn't look like much, most of the time, it's so much. And I think, just to get back to the point, there's so much you can do outside of riding. And if your horse is saying no, maybe it is time to take a look at a few different things and just reevaluate what's going on. I mean, of course, consider pain, then consider the training, make sure it's clear, you're reinforcing often enough, you know what you're doing, your horse is equipped to handle the questions that, and like behavioral expectations you're asking, and be sure that everything is going well and that the horse is comfortable and confident. If the horse lacks comfortability and confidence, he is not going to willingly ride. But if he has those things in place, you will have a yes horse all day, every day, and then you will realize that maybe you did not understand what you were bargaining for, because now you cannot walk up to your horse without them demanding you work with them because they enjoy it so much. And then you feel bad every time you have to leave the farm and drive past them or walk out your front door because they just whinny at you and you want to work with them, but you can't because you have to go get food.
Well, and that goes right into our next question. Like, what are your goals for riding and how do you go about achieving them? I mean, I'm sure you agree with this heavily, but like, that's exactly it, is to have fun. I love groundwork. I can do groundwork every day. I love voice commands. I've said already twice, is I want to just do everything off voice commands and just communication, and just, it's like I said, it looks boring and invisible sometimes, but that's what it is, and it's fun.
Yeah, and I mean, I can't tell you how many times growing up I was taught that, your cues are supposed to look invisible. And I think positive reinforcement is really effective at that. And to your point about riding being fun, I think that there is this phenomenon that happens for a lot, if not nearly all equestrians. We start out riding, at least most of us, because we are obsessed with horses. We love them. All we can think about, we draw them, we pretend to be them in our younger years, and we just beg our parents until they're ready to pull their hair out to let us ride. And then when we do, we start riding and we love it and we have so much fun. I remember when I first started riding, I refused to put a saddle on my 22-year-old quarter horse, Bingo Bug Fuzz, because I had so much fun riding bareback. That's all I wanted to do. I just wanted to ride bareback and do nothing else.
I was the same. Yeah, it was just so exciting.
Yeah, and then I moved to an eventing barn. They made me put a saddle on. Was not happy about that. They told me I needed to kick him and spur him and whip him when he wouldn't get his right lead because he was being obstinate, which a 22-year-old quarter horse being obstinate, right, he's arthritic is the problem. And I never wanted to do those things. Those rides made me sick, but gradually you start to become okay with it, and you start to justify it in your mind because it must be done. You're being yelled at from a superior on the ground who knows more than you, and then you start to invalidate your own intuition, and you're like, well, they must be right. I don't know why I'm being such a pansy about this, and like, I need to do it, That's just how you train horses. There has to be discipline or the horse will run all over you, and then you start adopting that mindset. You go from a child that loved the animal and was, resistant to even brushing the horse hard because you didn't want to hurt them, to someone who is discussing training in a way that, puts down the horse, that they're something to, fight against, that, if you don't correct that behavior, it's just going to get worse. And, if you give the horse an inch, it'll take a mile. You must be the leader, blah, blah, blah. All of this. I did a whole series on dominance, but I really think that is an important facet of all of this, is that, if your goal is to enjoy your horse and have fun, you have to let go of some of those old ideologies that, you get indoctrinated into. And that's not because I'm a conspiracy theorist and I'm like, in the traditional world, they're trying to brainwash you. But to some degree, it is a little bit, because that's not how you started out. That's not what felt right to you. But you had to adjust how you felt in order to get the things you wanted. And you and I are suggesting that there is another way to get the things that you want without having to do those things, if they make you uncomfortable or ever did at one point, and maybe you would like to do something else.
Yeah, be childish, ride bareback, have fun, enjoy your horse.
Yes, as long as your horse isn't Zoe and hates bareback because her back hurts. Okay, sorry, so preachy today, apparently. I have a lot to say. Riding is a hot topic, but we're trying to burn through these. This is going to be a long episode. I might have to actually break it up, but we'll see. Okay, so how do you get moving? You're on the horse. You've done all of that. How on earth do you move?
All right, with Arabs, I have an abundance of them. Speed, energy, and engagement, it's rarely a problem.
Yeah.
But, I get it. I work with plenty of horses where it is a problem. Even sometimes with speed being so eager, it can create a problem. But I've also had horses who were very just overall reluctant to move forward, to even take that step. That's Bella and Jack and Luke and Gulliver and Uma. But most of them also had different solutions. So Bella, she's my oldest Arab. She's about 20. She had severe arena anxiety. Any forward movement was terrifying. So that was just a matter of being brave and helping her be brave and make nothing of it. It's just a step forward. And I actually ended up just taking all of her tack away. Half the time I wasn't even sitting on her. That actually was the big thing, though, taking her tack away and just letting her be free. Then, yeah, she can walk from one cone to another cone.
Right.
Jack and Luke. Jack was the cord from a few years ago, and Luke is my off-the-track thoroughbred. For them, it was about baggage. So for them, I had to make forward movements fun and do it with them and add these fun little cues like voice commands are super fun for most horses.
Yeah, and I think that's the key. And like I was saying earlier with Zoe, the leg is such a problematic cue for her, applying pressure to get her to go forward, because she is so reactive off my leg that I would much rather train a Zoe trot or a Zoe trot than applying leg pressure. And that, like you said, there are many different solutions to the same, issue or training behavior. But I really think that there's a lot more nuance than I think you can have in the negative reinforcement world. And I think you get a lot more options with positive reinforcement. Not to put down negative reinforcement, but typically moving forward is you might cluck first. If the horse doesn't move, you apply your leg. And if they don't move, you apply your leg harder. If they don't move, you might spur. If they don't move, you whip. And until the horse goes forward, you increase pressure. And it might not happen, to that extreme every time. But eventually the horse starts to go forward off of the voice cue because they're trying to avoid the escalation of pressure. And that is what happened with Zoe. And, her being who she is, that created a lot of anxiety. It doesn't happen for every horse. Sometimes you end up with the shutdown horses like you were talking about. But I think I pretty much agree with you that I would likely start on the ground, as is every behavior, and probably target or walk on, since Zoe gets that pretty well, just from me moving, and then isolate it, adding a vocal cue, and then me standing still, asking her to walk, and then transferring it to the saddle. I think that's probably...
Yeah, and I mean, it's subjective too. Each horse is different. So like Gulliver, he's the Vanner and Shire Cross. He's young and he's just insecure. He's young, he's green, he's in a new place without his owner. She sent him to me for training, for context. So for him, it's like making it simple. But something that's really helped me work with horses, especially new horses, is defining what kind of learner they are. So for example, Bella and Uma, remember Bella is my older Arab, and then Uma is the deaf Mustang. They're both heavily visual learners. So cones are extremely beneficial for them. Some of my other horses are more audible learners. They work well off of sound more than anyone else. And then a few of the horses are good physical learners. They value that type of learning the most. But then, when you're breaking it down to speed and movement and just, moving forward, and you get down to extension and high energy and complicated like stacking of behaviors, bluntly put, this is where you need to be a good rider. And I mean it, a good rider. You have to be balanced. You have to be educated. You have to understand how your horse moves, why he moves, where he's stiff, how he engages or why he doesn't engage, et cetera, et cetera.
As well as yourself.
And then stay out of his way and make a cue after. Be fluid. Like if your horse doesn't go forward, maybe it's because he doesn't want to do something else. If you repeat what your horse is struggling with, he's going to lose even more will to perform it. And I guarantee if your horse is not moving forward and you think you've tried everything, then I guarantee there's an underlying anxiety.
Right. And I was going to say, when you said if you ask your horse to move forward and he doesn't, it's because he doesn't want to. My first question is why? Why doesn't the horse want to move forward? And the easiest thing to slap on there is a label that the horse is lazy, which is rarely ever the case. I have yet to encounter a horse that refuses to move forward because he has a personality defect. Horses mostly want to move forward. They are designed biologically to move all the time. And if your horse is balking and doesn't want to move forward, it's likely a fear, pain, or anxiety or confusion issue.
Or PTSD. That's what I've run into a lot, is that just riders in the past have made things so difficult and complicated, confusing, or just traumatic that they do not want to move forward because they don't know you and they don't know what you're going to do.
Right. And on the high energy movements they're going to require a higher level reinforcement. And also there's something to be said about when you are reinforcing, you're creating a positive association with that behavior, which can also become a motivator. It's what we call secondary reinforcers. So if the horse has a really positive association based on your reinforcement history and your training that you've done with them, they have a really positive association with, say, canter transitions, then the horse is going to love doing canter transitions. And then you can slowly start to build, and this is where you get to be able to do more and go for longer, because the cues themselves, and this is what we call behavior chains, the cue becomes a reinforcer in and of itself. It releases those feel-good emotions and hormones, neurochemicals, whatever, in the brain that make the horse enjoy it. It's something akin to what they get out of a primary reinforcer, those feel-good things like dopamine. And so when you are, say, riding around the arena and you ask your horse for a trot transition, once your horse has a reinforcement history and really has a strong understanding of those cues, then you can start to go for longer. And then that trot cue will lead to the canter cue, and then you can canter. And then maybe when you get done with your canter, you can click and treat. And now you've done a behavior chain. And that's how you build up to being able to do more. And like you said, with biomechanics, it comes from not only the horse, but also yourself. And I know that it gets really tricky, especially with finances. But for me, having a chiropractor has been the biggest help ever, because my right hip is 3 inches higher and tilted like 1 inch to 2 inches more forward than my left hip. So imagine what my ass looks like in a saddle. So
no, we're lucky too. We have a physical therapist who comes to my boss's barn, and that was game changing. I have an extremely traumatic left shoulder injury, and that shoulder doesn't particularly change things, but I spent so much time fixing that shoulder that now my right shoulder has completely, like my whole right side has collapsed because I didn't put in that time with
and
that side.
I had the same issue. Zoe, once upon a time, I was lunging her and she had a little woohoo zoomy moment on the lunge line, and she about yanked my right arm out of socket. And I must have torn something, and because I could not ride unless my shoulder was like KT taped, and it hurt so bad. And then I started compensating everywhere else in my body, and like with my hips, it was like I was permanently stuck cantering to the right in all gaits and all directions, because my hip was forward and then I was blocking her with my left hip. And so, I mean, it's really important that you are aware of the issues that you have and the compensations that you're making. We're never going to be perfect. Nobody is ever beautifully balanced. The horses are never going to be beautifully balanced, but you have to take those things into consideration, especially when your horse is not responding to something. Like Zoe was always very hard to bend left, and she would fight me and brace, go figure, because I'm stuck going right. So just be aware of when you run into issues and things like that. As you were saying about being a really good rider, is you have to be aware of where you might be blocking, and then find a unique way that you can ride to change those things and modify it to fit your body. And then, you can work around those issues, even if you don't have a body worker that can help you with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's an investment. If you want to be a NASCAR driver, then you have to learn how to drive really well. But I think that's a good way to finish off this question is, simply put, just reward what you want. If you want your horse, ask yourself, what do I want my horse to do? I want my horse to move forward. So then reward it for moving forward. If your horse offers just a step of the slow, the balanced, collected, steady, or hesitant, reward it. Like, it's super simple. You have to reinforce what you want your horse to repeat.
Right. This goes back to the definition of positive reinforcement. You are strategically adding a reinforcer to increase the behaviors you want to see more of. And if your horse has a strong reinforcement history, of walking around with their back lifted and their haunches engaged and their head lowered, carrying themselves properly, then A, you probably won't need a bridle anymore. And B, you won't see those other, maladaptive self-carriage models. And then your horse will be better educated, healthier, and able to carry themselves without much interference from you. And then you can work on other things. And that's how you start building to create your ideal competition horse, that's able to do all of these incredible things, because you have the foundation and the horse has a reinforcement history of the things that you want to see. I get this question a lot with horses that drag people over to the grass. I'm like, okay, so your horse is dragging you to the grass because it is motivated to get the grass, and it's more motivating than you yanking on their face trying to deter them. So what are you doing to make leading motivating? Zero things.
I actually talked a lot about in one of my posts about trailer loading. I try to make sure that my horse is not particularly following my body, but following, simply put, where I'm asking them to go. Usually that means following my hand. A lot of times, well, especially like Lily and Nova, who are very personable horses, they want to walk right on top of me, then open my hand and have them follow my hand. And if they're crossing over behind me, then if they're on my left side, I want them on my right, then just open my right hand and they can easily see that. They're like, oh, you want me to go over there?
Yeah, you're giving them direction and information of how you want them to behave, as well as, I would assume, reinforcing for the behaviors you want to see. If the horse isn't being reinforced for the right behaviors outside of the absence of you doing anything that they don't like, it's probably not going to be very motivating in most cases, especially when you have, beautiful, lush summer grass beside you. The horse is like, I'll take the few yanks that I'm inevitably going to get on my face, so I can do this. And also, I would not want my horse to lead beautifully because he is avoiding me yanking on his face,
Yeah, and actually that's something that I've had to deal with a lot because we've had a lot of horses in recovery lately at my boss's place. And when I start having to tack walk them and get them back up into reconditioning, it's so scary because these horses are just going to seemingly unpredictably explode. And I've been thinking about that a lot because I will never have that problem with my horses. They genuinely enjoy walking with me. I I hand walk them literally all the time and everywhere, especially when it's raining. We hand walk down to the public arena because the sand dries faster and it's softer, so they can go run and roll and all that. But they walk quietly there. They walk quietly back, no matter how often they're like staying under shelter to stay out of the rain and feeling cooped up. Again, reward the behaviors you want to see, but also make yourself something that your horse wants to be with and to follow, and know that they know that things are just happier and quiet with you.
And beyond that, you saying that going to the arena where they can run and buck and roll and play is another thing to consider about leading, is if your horse is resisting going where you're going, do they want to go there? Is it a good place to go? Because if your horses are like, yes, I get to go back to the pasture to see my buddies, awesome, they're probably not going to drag you to the grass. If they're like, yes, I get to go run around and buck and play in this arena, awesome, probably not going to drag you to the grass. So that's another thing to consider. Okay, so next question. It ties in well to what we were just talking about biomechanics, as far as getting those movements, like setting a horse up for a fence when you need connection. Because a lot of people, at least the way I was trained, was that when you are setting a horse up for a jump, or you're trying to get hind end engagement or a proper bend, that you must be connected to your horse at all times. And even Jim Wofford, when I rode under him, he said that your release is a misnomer. When people say you go over a fence and you have an automatic release or a crest release or whatever, you're not actually ever supposed to release. You're supposed to, sorry, my cat is on my desk knocking things over, but that you're not ever actually supposed to release. You're supposed to follow the horse and maintain connection with proper position. Now, knowing what I know, I could not disagree more with that.
Well, that just goes into how you want to ride. If that's something that you want, is to be connected through your hands at all times, then you know what? That's on you. For me, that's not my style. For me, connection is through my seat. Like I said, Lily's a bridleless horse. I ride bridleless all the time. I have absolutely no problem rocking her back and just thinking with her. But at the same time, she is a naturally phenomenal jumper. I am not a person who wants to jump a horse that is not naturally good at it, because to me that is unsafe.
Yeah. And I mean, for Zoe, it's hard to say because so much of what we did was so incorrect. I actually spent a lot of time watching videos the other day of us competing. And I noticed, because I'm looking at things with a different eye now, in our more recent show jumping rounds, it was really interesting. About us like 3 to 4 strides out from the fence, she would throw her head up and she essentially would yank the reins out of my hand, so that when she got to the base of the fence, she could use her brachiocephalic muscles, which are those that connect their neck to their chest. So she could physically pull herself up and pull her front end up, rather than sit back on her haunches and round her back and lift that way. She was pulling herself up, and if I had connection and I was holding her head down, she couldn't do that. I'm not saying what she did was the correct way to jump, but she was compensating for her back pain, and in doing so, it was just funny how she adapted to that, but also, like, that should have been a red flag to me, and it never was. She was using herself incorrectly because of issues she was having, and me being able to rock her back would have been very helpful, but we never really worked on that. It was kind of just, well, make it look nice and, collect her up to the base of the fence so she has to hit the mark or whatever. I thought that shortening her stride in some ways would rock her back. And I guess it does sort of, but it wasn't achieving, good position.
Well, and Lily made me respect that. What I mean by when I said, like, I don't want to jump a horse that's not good at jumping, because Lily was really good at jumping, and she was speeding up for different reasons, but she would sometimes speed up because she saw a better distance than I did.
Yeah.
And in that case, when I have a horse that's good at jumping, I have to trust her and I have to believe in her. And sometimes she's going to save me more than I'm going to save her.
Yeah.
But it's, if your horse is really struggling to sit back, then guess what? I'm going to say something that I haven't said before ever in my life. Do groundwork. Do things on the ground. If you can't do it in a halter with a lunge line, or if you can't, for me, my personal thing is if I can't do this bridleless, I shouldn't do it at all. Think about stuff like that. Like what is making you feel like you can do this when you can't do it in another situation?
Right. And I'm sort of the same way in the less is more aspect, that I would like to be able to do all things bridleless, because then that would mean that my horse truly understands how to properly carry herself in a way that is not only safe and effective for us, but also healthy for her body. And, I think, like I was saying earlier about traditional eventing, is to us, and I know that I'm not speaking to a pocket of the world, and I haven't explored all realms of eventing, but my experience with North American eventing is that groundwork is predominantly just lunge line work, occasionally in Pessoa systems or side rein systems. And while that can do some things, it normally doesn't do what it's supposed to. And then you're not setting the horse up to be able to know how to do the movements that you're going to ask under saddle on his own. So then you're lumping everything together, and the horse asking the horse to do these incredibly difficult movements. They are not designed to sit on their hind ends. 60% of their body weight is up front for a reason. The things we are asking them to do are unnatural, so we might as well at least give them the benefit of doing it well in a way that supports their overall health, and we don't end up like with hock issues like Zoe, or back issues and all of the other issues.
Yeah, and if your horse can't do it without a rider, then what makes you think they're going to do it with a rider?
I know.
You're carrying an extra 100 or 200 pounds.
Yeah, that is a significant portion of their body weight. And to the people that are like, oh, well, whatever, I don't want to do groundwork, I implore you to go slap on a backpack with whatever the percentage of your body weight to your horse's body weight is, and go run for the duration of the time that you're asking your horse to ride. It is incredibly taxing, especially if you're just pulling the horse out of the paddock after a week off. You have to do strength training just as much as you would for yourself. And that is something that I severely missed, and I think that a lot of disciplines really, really miss. And you just go straight to getting on because that's the fun part, and who wants to do groundwork? It's so boring. But if you make it fun for both of you, then it's not so bad. Because you enjoy
that's
it.
Into the second half of that question too, like how can you have proper connection, hind end engagement, inside leg to outside rein? If you're going to ask that question, then you also need to first answer, what does that mean? What is hind end engagement? Like, can you see it? Can you ask for it? Can you tell why the horse isn't doing it? So I'm going to try to make this as brief as possible, but inside leg to outside rein, it's more than just my horse is on the forehand, or that I have to push my horse from my inside leg to my outside rein. It's if your horse is on the forehand, then the inside front leg is likely stepping inward into the circle rather than forward. It likely also means that the inside hind leg is not crossing up underneath of the body. If the horse is sitting back, then you have to keep that inside hind leg underneath him. I'll tell some of my students to help them figure it out. If you can't feel when your horse is leaning on your inside leg, you might instead be able to feel when your outside rein is slack, or vice versa. You might, stuff like that. And if you can understand that and understand how horses do that and why horses do that, then you can teach it. So like for Lily, she knows very simply, I think this is one of our later questions on like how to turn. And this is one way that I teach it, especially with an advanced horse like Lily.
I hope you're going to use the analogy.
Back, her hip goes, like say we're tracking right. So her right hip goes to the left, and all I have to do is just keep that outside shoulder moving forward. The turn comes from the hind end pushing out, not from putting her nose onto the circle.
Yeah, I saw this really, really awesome graphic of a turning horse, and the first picture was of somebody riding, and it's like an aerial view, so like above the horse. If you pull on the inside rein to turn solely, you're using the inside neck muscles of the horse, and that only goes so far as the inside flank. But instead, if you use the outside of the horse to bend around, you're using from the outside hip to the outside ear. You're using those muscles to turn the horse around instead of the inside neck muscles, which is the goal. And please, for the sake of everyone listening, because it was so helpful for me, use your train analogy. Explain it. Go.
Yes. Okay. Actually, before I say that, just because you said inside hip to outside ear, you have to also think that the inside hip and the inside ear are constantly traveling in an uphill motion. But okay, the train analogy, because I saw a really fantastic visual of this, and then I was thinking, okay, how am I going to describe this without the visual? Your horse moves as a train where the wheels all follow the same track.
Yep.
It's not a truck and trailer where the truck has to make a wide turn so that the trailer can just skim the corner. And in the train analogy, your horse's nose also counts as the wheel. The nose leads, the front legs follow, and the hind legs follow. They're all on the same track. If you visualize the truck and trailer, or, especially those of you who do haul horses, you have to take such wide turns, especially if you're driving like 4-horse plus trailers. Mm-hmm. You have to take wide turns just to make the far hind wheels make that turn.
As well as the disconnection between the front half and the back half. It's if you're yeah, it's such a perfect metaphor, because if you're only turning based on the front end of the horse, you're missing half of the horse. Yes. And the most important part is the caboose. It's propelling everything.
And the wheels of the train are propelling the horse forward, whereas the truck and trailer, all the forward motion is coming from just the front end.
Right. And it's just such a brilliant metaphor. I love it, and I think it deserves to be heard. Okay, do you have anything else to say? Well, I guess I still want to talk about connection a little bit, because we touched on it a little bit. But from my perception and the way that I want to ride, I think there's a way in a world that I could make it look very similar to traditional training. And I just listened to a Shauna Karish episode about this. It's one of her more recent ones on the Clicker Training 101 for Horses or whatever podcast. And she just did an episode over this as well. But she talked about how she wanted all her cues to look very normal. So if her horse ended up with somebody else, they could still ride the horse and be effective, because the horse would already have the knowledge from the cues that it wouldn't need the escalation or necessarily the reinforcement. But in keeping connection, to me, it seems unnecessary now. Maybe for minor things, then I might use it. If Zoe were to get a little bit on her forehand, I might incorporate the connection after training, connection equals whoa, or even then I would be more inclined to use a verbal cue. I am sort of with you more so on the, if I can do it bridleless, then I have achieved the goal and I don't need it anymore. In my understanding of classical dressage is that the horse is to carry himself because he knows how to use his body and he is comfortable and balanced and strong, and you don't really need rider interference then, except for like turning and gait changes and things like that. So if you're having to hold your horse up or maintain connection to keep the behavior happening, it says to me that the horse doesn't understand duration or how to properly carry himself. Like if you let go and it all falls apart, that's not self-carriage.
Well, that goes right back into you get what you train. So for us, we mutually have a goal of using as few tools as possible. So we specifically train for that goal. With my boss's horses, some of them are very physically capable and they are easily going to be Grand Prix horses if they're not already. And so self-carriage is something that's very reasonable for them. Some of them, though, that have reached a Grand Prix level or are getting up there that are at least the 4th or the Prix St. George level, they're not trained for, that independent self-carriage. They're specifically trained to do it with the rider. So again, you get what you train for.
Right. And I think that goes back to the goals. If that is your goal, to have the horse depend on your hand for information of what it is supposed to be doing, that's one thing. But in my opinion, constant contact is the goal should be for it to be unnecessary, because that's subjective, because
you can make it look clean and fluid even if you are going to be using a lot of hand. But keep in mind, if you're going to use your hand, it has to come from your seat first, then your leg, and then it returns to your hand.
Yeah, and I think that is also the misconception that the horse has to be on your hand for it to work. And a lot of people unknowingly and unintentionally often ride off of their hand. I was one of those. Go back and watch some of my old videos and see if I look like I could ride without any reins.
Oh, we all are. I mean, we're humans. We use our hands for everything.
Yep.
Every single person is going to go through that phase, is they're going to be handsy with their riding. But then it's up to you, again, to take that initiative, take lessons, and pursue it, and train yourself how to ride without your hands.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that goes back to the strength training on both the horse and the rider. Can you both carry yourselves?
Yeah.
Okay, so the next question we have is what are some of the cues that you use and train for your horses? I think this has been predominantly answered, but are there any that we haven't really covered?
I love my whistle cue. It's my favorite thing in the entire world.
It looks so cool. Because didn't you pick it up from Lauren Alport?
I think I unintentionally did.
Yeah.
I have followed her for a long time, and I don't remember specifically thinking, oh, Lauren makes this sound, I'm going to do the same thing. But it just ended up happening. It was really funny. So for those of you who don't know, I do is my whistle cue. It does mean a few different things. I do use it as my bridge cue. It's usually, I guess, in general, the basic meaning of it is that the horse and I are together and there is a reward in that situation. So it could be if I'm bringing my horses in, that I whistle and they come to me. If, again, I use it as my bridge, but then it would be like, if I want the horse to stop and I approach the horse, I have to say whoa and then whistle. If I want the horse to just directly come to me, I would whistle. So I can use it for a few different things. But as far as my favorite cues go, definitely the whistle. I do like targeting cones. It's not for everyone. Actually, surprisingly, it's really not for Lily, but it is for other horses.
Yeah.
Let's see. I have the cone. I have the whistle. I do have two different target cues. I have target and I have touch. And the two distinctions between that are target is the horse approaches a stationary target. And for touch, it is that the horse has to remain stationary and reach his nose to a target.
Interesting. I was guessing that the distinction was going to be target would be following and touch would be like just to reach out and touch it or walk up and touch it.
Target I do use for like moving from cone to cone, but that it's also because I have the release cue. So I have to ask the horse to walk or trot on, or sometimes like Nova really knows let's go is that we are moving together. For target, I have found it really beneficial for like the photography horses. Like if you want that nice, beautiful outstretched neck, they know that all 4 feet remain still and then they reach for the stick. And I do use different targets. For target, it's a cone, and for touch, it's a stick.
Okay.
But while that's on my mind, I wouldn't particularly say it's my favorite cue, but it is something that I teach every single horse is whoa, and the meaning of whoa. Whoa does not mean like come down from a transition or come to a stop. It means stop. It means all 4 feet are still. And it does not mean you stop and then move forward again. You have to stop and then you have to give a release cue to move forward. I cannot stress that enough. Whoa is extremely important.
Yeah. How did you go about teaching that one?
It starts usually with I have to stop with them. It has to be our energy comes down and we're relaxed and our feet don't move. If the feet do move, then I just have to wait and I have to start again. If the feet continuously move, then I have to reward the moment that all 4 feet are still. It works in the cross ties. It works when I'm leading. It works when I'm riding. It's extremely beneficial.
Yeah, so just kind of every time you catch your horse about to stop, you just go ahead and cue.
It's 100% capturing an action.
Yeah. So another thing I just remembered that I wanted to say was that for those that might be listening and aren't familiar with the term bridge, it's a marker signal or the click. I use the sk sound, which I actually stole from Swing Jinx on Instagram, Solera. So we're all about stealing people's marker signals. I would so love to use a whistle, but my whistle isn't consistent enough due to chronic dry mouth. So
that is the important thing is my whistle's the same thing every time, specifically if I'm using it for a bridge. Whereas if I'm trying to bring my horses in, it might change a little bit, but that's just, it's sometimes I even just call their name and they come in. It's not super strict.
Yeah. And I think that's something important to consider. And something that I didn't consider that I will caution people against is when you are riding, if you choose my bridge signal, the sk sound has a tendency to get muffled in with hoof prints on sand. So sometimes I end up going like my horses can hear it.
People have with their iPhones, they have the little whistle sound for the text cue, and my horses will react to that.
That's so funny. Yeah, you have to be very careful. And a lot of people ask if you can use like a sound. I would really caution against that because that is such a common sound. You don't want to add any more confusion to your training when you're, say, at a competition and everybody's clucking at their horses and your horse is like, what is going on? There's so many clucks happening. So pick a sound that you can make consistently that can be heard. I know a lot of traditional clicker trainers use the sound. I personally hate that sound, and it takes a lot of effort for me to do that with my mouth, and I don't like the way it sounds, so that's why I opted for something else. You can also ride with a tangible clicker or make any number of sounds just as long as it's not confusing for your horse. I also know a lot of people choose a word for reinforcement. I don't know what your opinion is on that, but I
wouldn't do that. No.
There's so much variation in the way you say words. I mean, it works for some people. I know some people that definitely do that. They use good or yes, and they say it the same way. Particularly dog trainers, oddly enough, choose yes a lot, and they go, yes, but they say it that way every single time. And it is very difficult to do when you get a subpar behavior and you're like, I didn't really like that, but it was close enough. And you go, yes, your animal.
Well, that actually reminds me, that brings it up. You can teach your horse the meaning of good boy or good girl. Mm-hmm. It has to be like that. You have to have an emphasis to it, but you can associate positive things coming from that phrase, especially when you're riding. If you want your horse to continue doing something, but you want them to register that it is the correct thing, that it is very beneficial to have them understand, good boy, that's a great job.
Yeah, I actually have some links to information about keep going signals that I'll try to remember to link in the description of this episode down below. But yeah, those are super beneficial, especially in like what we were talking about with the behavior chains. So if you ask your horse to trot and you're not quite ready to reinforce, but you want to let your horse know that it was right, you can say good boy, but only if it's already a conditioned secondary reinforcer. So just like the bridge signal, for instance, is a secondary reinforcer. The horse knows that is associated with the food and the good things. And so if you associate the good with keep going and it's the right answer, food will come eventually, and now here's the click, then that's where you get that. Okay, so moving right along, we've already answered this in part, but how do you ride any amount of distance, even one lap around the arena, while riding with positive reinforcement?
So people tend to ask, like, when can I stop using the treats, which I'm sure you've heard a million times. That's not how it works. It's that you increase the length of a behavior or the length in between treats or the stack of behaviors between those rewards. Yeah. You don't take those rewards away. So if you take the rewards away, the horse will stop presenting that action. If you want to be doing laps on laps on laps, you have to start with steps on steps on steps. Mm-hmm. Even though, I don't work my horses into a sweat, but it at least starts, especially with those reactive horses, you have to be rewarding those quiet, calm, relaxed steps. And then eventually those get longer and longer, and the horse continues that frame of mind. And then, sometimes it's really just before you know it, you're just going all the way around the arena. Again, with my forward horses, speed's not a problem, and most of the time moving forward consistently is not a problem. And they do enjoy just cantering around and around and around. It's really fun for them. But I also use a lot of trail riding. I have tons of trails. I love trail riding. It's very fun for all of us. And that really helps just extending that time between rewards, because the horse is getting natural positive reinforcements from just doing the action. They love being on trail. They love galloping along. It's fun for the both of us.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to the behavior chains and making sure your horse understands reinforcement. If you slow down, you go faster, and it's all about building that foundation. I don't know if you guys are getting a feel for the theme here, but if you set up for success, then you will have a horse with 0 holes in its training. And I understand the thing that we all want to do is ride. That's the whole reason everybody gets into horses, is because you want to ride, and it seems really inconvenient and annoying when you could just get on and kick and then off you go, and then you just ride the whole time that you want to until you're done.
I mean, it's convenient until you land yourself in the hospital, we'll put it that way.
Yeah, or you have a horse that's costing you oodles of money in vet bills because it's stressed and unhappy.
Yes.
Or if it just doesn't, and then you might end up with a horse that doesn't like you very much or isn't really enjoying his job. I mean, there are endless answers based on the individual horse, but I think really the best shot that you have at having a mutually joyful and beneficial experience for the both of you would be to do it that way for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see. How do you turn and change directions? What's the best way to do this bridleless versus bridled, since we've been talking about that?
So this goes, again, what I mentioned earlier, the audible learners, visual learners, physical learners, and also what I explained with Lily about bending and turning coming from the hip and the control of the hind end rather than pointing her nose on track. Granted, if the hind end is correct, the nose naturally goes on track. But in addition to that, Lily particularly knows other way as the signal to switch leads. That's something, again,
so
big shock, I taught in groundwork, and it just eventually transferred into saddle. That helped because prior to that, especially when I did train her more traditionally, lead changes were extremely stressful. They were speedy and they were tense. Yep. So she naturally did flying changes. Not every horse can do that. Nova especially is not capable of that.
Yeah.
But that was it was, again, capturing the behavior. She naturally did the flying change. Sometimes it would just be opening my hand and she would just switch directions and do a flying change, and I would just capture the cue to that. But there's other ways. With Uma, the deaf Mustang, how to move off the leg without increase of pressure. Again, pressure's your friend. But Uma is also heavily visual, and so is Bella. So cones, again, were a really great asset. Again, you have a departure cue for Bella that was audible, for Uma that was sometimes physical, that was sometimes visual, depending on how many people you have working with her. We do often, when someone's riding her, we have someone on the ground as well. But cones help, targets help, visual things help, especially with those visual learners. A lot of times you won't realize how advantageous your visual cues are until you meet a visual horse. And then once they can calmly move from cone to cone, then you can start associating physical or audible cues with that. Nova is visual and audible, absolutely not physical. You cannot use physical cues with him. And then on the ground, he follows an open hand. I taught this with lunging, that I didn't want to be chasing him with a whip or escalating my voice commands into pressure. So I taught him to follow. If I open my hand, if I open my right hand, he tracks right. My left hand, he tracks left. Lunging and following, it's all like that. So when I started riding him and I taught him turning, I used a drastically open rein so he could see it from me in the saddle behind him. And then now that he's much further along, he knows that he can move off the leg, he can side pass, he can get his hind underneath him, and my weight shift as I switch directions, my shoulders will tilt, the left lead versus the right lead. All of that comes, but of course I originally had to have that steering, because steering is as important as halting. So that's how it worked. It was visual. He could see that my hand was opening. It looked somewhat traditional, but again, it had heavily underlying positive reinforcement cues.
Right. It's motivated by the positive reinforcement, not by the release of pressure. And that is the key difference. And I think another way that I have heard about teaching turning with positive reinforcement, especially if you're in a situation like I am where you're by yourself literally 24/7, and the people that are here are definitely not going to help you clicker train a horse. So even my boss, she's like, nope, that's your thing. And she'll let me problem solve, but that's not really her prerogative. So, and that's fine. That's okay. But that just means I have to do a lot of things by myself. And this solution I thought sounded like a really awesome idea. And I wish I'd heard about it when I started Zoe under saddle again prior to Kissing Spine, was to have a handheld target on you, and sort of like what you were saying with the open rein is you can just, if your horse, assuming, is good at targeting and following a target, you can hold the target out to the side and have the horse move forward towards it around a turn. And then you can start, whether you're in a neck rein or a neck ring, or have reins on. God, my brain is dead. Then you can start to incorporate the tactile cue. It's not, the horse is not turning because you're pulling on one side of his neck and they're moving off of the pressure, or because you're pulling on one side of his mouth and he's trying to go with that pressure to get it to ease up. So instead, the new cue, or the old cue, is going to be the target, the first cue that you've taught on the ground. And then when you're in the saddle, you present the target, and then after you get the turn a few times, you start to introduce that the neck rope is going to touch them on the outside of their neck. Then you're going to present the target, get the turn, click, treat, and then eventually you start to fade out the target because, like we've said 100 times now, the neck rope or your rein contact on the bit is going to predict that a turn is coming, and then the horse starts to turn just based off the tactile cue, because it's motivated by positive reinforcement, not because the horse is trying to get you to take the pressure off. It's also important here to be sure that you are not using negative reinforcement under the guise of a tactile cue. Because if you're still pulling, then, I mean, you're kind of defeating your positive reinforcement work, because then it's not making sense to the horse, and you need to back up a step and make sure they really understand turning with the target, and that the turn cue that's tactile is predicting it so that you don't have to pull, and that the horse responds when you give the cue, and then there's no need to escalate the pressure. So did I explain that well? I don't know.
No, you did. And I actually want to mention, because I also saw the steering coming from a handheld target when the willing equine, Adele, originally did it. And it does work. I'm not at all gonna say that it doesn't, especially with Uma. I think we did that as well. But the reason that I didn't do that with Nova, and a lot of people don't think about this, because I don't think people understand the extent of how reactive he was, and most people don't handle a horse like that. Yeah. If I was holding a handheld target, that was just much too triggering for him. I had to use something else. He's very comfortable with me in the saddle, but I still can't hold backpacks. Adjusting my girth I can, but adjusting my stirrup I think is too much for him. He loves my Western saddle. It's a Wintech, so it's super lightweight, but he loves it because the leg flaps are just straight down the sides. It took him a really long time to get used to the dressage saddle because the leg flaps flap. It was just way too much for him.
And
so
that's another thing
to consider those.
Yeah, another thing to definitely consider about the individual horse and their history. And if your horse was maybe an off the track and has a history of like excessive whipping and things flapping and meaning going forward, that might not be an option. I actually saw it from Fair Horsemanship on the webinar she did. I have like a very vague memory of Adele doing it, but I guess I don't remember. I'll have to go back and look at her stuff too. And I think that would work for Zoe because she's not particularly reactive to whips, mostly because she didn't race for very long. And I think I used a whip on her maybe once or twice in her whole life because she's always been so forward. But yeah, that's definitely something to consider. Okay, so our next question is, do you ever get to a point of clicking behaviors and rewarding at the end? Like, I'm assuming they mean at the end of like an entire dressage test or a jumping course.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But again, that's very advanced. You have to work your horse up to that. Nova is, reaching that point. I really can't go through a whole dressage test without rewarding him yet. I can get to the end of the test, but there's rewards in between. That used to not even be the case. We used to only be able to ride for 5 minutes. After that, it was 10 minutes, and then 15 minutes, and then we could actually finish the test. Lily, who's much further along, flat work, she will not accept complete flat work without a reward. Jumping,
it's boring.
She won't do this anymore. Oh, say that?
It's boring.
Yes, it's boring. And also Lily just overall, about a year ago, she just kind of decided she wasn't a riding horse anymore, which again, totally fine. I love her to death. But back when she was a jumping horse, courses were easy for her because she brought so much energy to the table and because it just was a thing. It was very fluid. It flowed very, very well. And you have to be careful when you do that, because part of that was I let her amp herself up, and that was fine. I could handle that. But again, if I wanted to ride something bridleless, I can't control an amped up horse or
Right.
two amped up horse with just a neck rope. So you have to be very careful about what you're doing. Again, we've said it like 3 times. You get what you train.
Yeah, and I definitely got that with Zoe as well. She also got very amped up and excited and or anxious, who knows, about jumping. I like to think she liked it. She on cross country, I've never seen her eyes brighter.
Yeah.
But it definitely was something that I would never have done bridleless, because I would not have had an ounce of control, because I could stop her via her face in a bridle. Even though we only ever, I think the worst, quote unquote, worst bit I ever put in her mouth was a thin Wonder bit that has like the rings and then the 2 rings on the inside of the top and the bottom of the bit, not on the outside. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Okay, so that was like the strongest bit we had on her. And so, that's not a very strong bit. But it's still, I couldn't have done it without that. And that will be our goal. If she does end up becoming a jumping horse again, which who knows, because of her hocks, it's mildly concerning to me, but that will be up to her. But yeah, I think that is definitely... there's nothing for me to say there. I'm already thinking about something else, so I'm just going to do it. So another consideration that you and I talked about before we jumped on this was that for some reason it seems very odd to reinforce horses with positive reinforcement, all the while you're riding. But in negative reinforcement, if you think about it, the entire time you're riding, you're reinforcing your horse. You are constantly adding pressure, releasing pressure, adding pressure, releasing pressure. You're reinforcing over and over and over and over and over again. And you're not having to chain any behaviors together. You don't have to work on anything being inherently reinforcing. You don't have to use keep going signals and all of that. And while it sounds great, sometimes you end up with emotional fallout or confusion because it gets all thrown in together. Whereas with positive reinforcement, you have to build from the beginning. Otherwise, you're not going to get the behavior at all. And so I think that's where it requires a lot of nuance and education as well, which, I guess could be a deterrent for some people. But I should think that if you're wanting to compete at a higher level and ride with a large amount of skill, you should want to have that amount of education under your belt. And that takes personal initiative, of course, but in order to ride with positive reinforcement, you're asking for a really, really complex behavior chain to get a couple of alfalfa pellets at the end. You better be sure that your reward is going to be worth the time that the horse took to do the behavior. And, if that's the case, it might involve you getting off and ending the session there because they did such a good job. Why drill? And give them a really nice reward, maybe graze them for a while after, something that is like really a big deal to the horse, or their favorite treat, even though it might be a little sugary like carrots.
No, that's very important to say, because that goes right back to greed. If something works, you want to keep doing it naturally because, oh my God, it's working. Let's do it. Let's do it. And that's why people are so drawn to the negative reinforcement, because you kick and kick and kick. And even if you're increasing the pressure that you're using, it's still working. And like you said, you're reinforcing constantly, even if you're using negative reinforcement. Yes. So again, make sure that your reward is as valuable as the behaviors that you are stacking.
Yes, because you're not asking one individual behavior like a turn through negative reinforcement, and then you're getting the release on the end, which is the reinforcer. You can't do that in positive reinforcement in order to look like traditional riding or normal riding. It has to be much harder, and it requires much more skill. And that's where I have so much respect for people like Georgia Bruce that ride full dressage tests competitively with positive reinforcement, and she's a para equestrian. Like, brilliant individual. And so things like that, I mean, it takes a lot of time and skill. And do you know what level she rides at? It's very high level dressage, I'm pretty sure.
No, I really don't. I wouldn't be able to tell you. I haven't seen enough of her tests. I've only seen her on Instagram.
Me neither. But she is incredible, and she's a very skilled trainer. And that is the thing. Like, I mean, and that's not to say that negative reinforcement trainers at that level aren't skilled either. Of course they are. But you get to reinforce every step. So it's not necessarily a fair comparison between the two. I mean, you can look at positive reinforcement trainers having to stop every other circle, but also the fact that they're getting that circle without any reinforcement is ridiculously impressive and speaks a lot to the level that their horse is enjoying what's happening as well, you know, because they're doing it.
Well, and your green 6-year-old is not going to be performing piaffe and passage. You
right.
know, it takes training.
Yeah, exactly. And you can't expect to jump all the way there, especially when positive reinforcement is still in its infancy in the equestrian world. I mean, it's going to take a lot of personal education because it's not the predominant way to train. So it's going to be harder right now. But if more of us start using it, then it becomes more accessible. More people start using it. Less people have to do it the hard way, like you and me.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's move on to if someone isn't interested in switching to mainly or completely positive reinforcement, what are some things they can do to make their training more enjoyable for the horse while ridden?
Tricks. Do tricks. They're so much fun. Or I also do a lot of one-time lessons with people like in their cross ties or their stall with their horse. Because people don't want to do plus R because they think it's too much work. Like we just said, you know, if you're going to get to those high levels, then you have to put in all the training to it. And then for them, you know, if they haven't done plus R before, then it is just too different sometimes. But, you know, straight up, if you want to learn something, you have to put in that effort and you have to try. If you were to, you know, with how quickly people quit when they try plus R, if you quit that quickly when you were starting to ride, then
I was just about to say, yeah. And I mean, think about how many years of training most of us go through. Like you said, you started riding around 5 or 6. Or 4 or 5, whatever you said. I can't remember. I started riding around 7 or 8. And I've been riding for well over a decade now, and being 22. And so, I mean, like, that's how much time and effort I put into my education in riding. And rarely any of it was book learning. A lot of us get really used to just having somebody tell us what to do and relying on one or a couple professionals at maybe clinics or something to give you the information. But if you really take on that personal responsibility, you like inevitably will have a better relationship and understanding of how you interact with your horse. Because if you're just relying on somebody else, you're getting their relationship with your horse essentially via you. But if you take it upon yourself to do the research and learn, and with people like me and Caine, we are putting out as much information as we can to help people along and make it easier for you. And so, I mean, it is difficult, but think about how much time you've put into your traditional riding. And if you put even, I mean, like I said, I think I've been training with positive reinforcement for 2 going on 3 years, and I know way more about riding, horse health, care, training, biomechanics, like everything. I know so much more in the past 3 years than I ever learned in those like 10 plus of me riding traditionally, because I was relying on somebody else to teach me everything. They don't have time, especially when you've got like 2 lessons a week that are maybe an hour long. You're probably not going to get a quality, well-rounded education. Whereas if you study it on your own, through sources from that other people have taken the time to put out, there's so many out there that are more than willing to help you. They also offer online courses and coaching, and there's so much that can help you if you're not a book learner. Like you were talking about the different types of learners with horses. People are the same way. That's why I make this podcast for people that are auditory learners. This is very easy for you, and you're getting a lot of education here.
Well, and just put a tree pouch on. You know, it very quickly becomes natural to reward often and quickly, because guess what? Your horse loves it and will help teach you even if he isn't previously experienced with it. And tricks are fun, but they can get dangerous if you're not careful. But then sometimes, like with my thoroughbred Luke, daily things like grooming and tacking up works great for him and rewarding that kind of stuff. He was really cinchy even after he was finishing treatment for ulcers. And it helped him learn how to control reactions and overall just make things pleasant because he was still anticipating that pain. Right. It also got him excited to come out of his stall because he was previously just like such a shutdown horse. He wanted nothing to do with people around him. It helped teach him to halter himself. All of my horses, if I walk in and I hold a halter out, they turn around and they dip their nose into the halter. Stuff like that. And you can even go as far as using it in lunging, like if your horse can lunge in a halter. If he can't, you can use it to teach your horse to lunge in a halter and quietly hand walk. Especially like those horses in recovery, like I mentioned, they can't ride, so then do plus R instead. Yeah. They can walk calmly despite all that pent up energy. It's helpful and it's good enrichment for your horse, and it absolutely develops that, bond that everyone wants. It's a relationship with this companion.
Yeah, and outside of extraneous, unmeasurable elements of bond, by simple science, you are associating yourself with a primary reinforcer, i.e. food. So you become associated with food, not necessarily in that you are a treat dispenser, but that your horse experiences good emotions around you and starts to really enjoy your presence. And then you end up with this animal that is brilliantly happy to see you and you cannot peel them off your side to save your life.
But isn't that the greatest part? Like, yes. I have my cat growing up was always on my shoulders. I would do chores around the house and she'd just sit on my shoulders. My dog was in my lap more than he wasn't, so what that it's a 1,000-pound animal. I mean, of course, teach it your boundaries, understand that it doesn't have boundaries or it has different boundaries, but it's fun. It's this really awesome relationship and it's healthy and it's sweet, and like having a horse love you is just fantastic.
Yeah, it's very akin to cats. You feel very chosen.
Yes.
And I mean, I think as far as if you want to switch, or if you aren't interested in switching mainly to positive reinforcement under saddle, at least starting to look at your horse in a different way that's not so adversarial as is often common. And I don't think people really realize how adversarial they view their horses until, like me, like I stepped outside of that world and then I was like, holy shit, I didn't realize I hated her so much. Like, I mean, every time I interacted with her, I was like, oh, she's doing this wrong. Oh, she's trying to get the better of me. Oh, look, she thought she could outsmart me and she didn't.
It's like your relationship with your significant other. They shouldn't piss you off. You should want to be around each other. And then if you're not around each other, it shouldn't be toxic otherwise,
Exactly. And that was such a huge eye-opener for me that it wasn't weird, or that it was weird that my horse didn't want to come up to me. And she didn't necessarily run as she got older, but she definitely never came up to me or initiated contact. It was always me contacting her. And that's not a healthy human-to-human relationship either. If you're the only one putting in anything and trying to get the other person to love you, it's not really a good relationship. And I mean, back to what you were saying about like how you can incorporate it in parts. Like, for instance, you reminded me of a horse that we had that literally passed out in the cross ties. I've told the story on here a few times, but he would stand, and the second I brought out the saddle, he would start closing his eyes, his knees would buckle, he would start swaying. And one day I had my saddle put on, and just out of curiosity, because I was like, there's no way this horse is going to fall over. He will catch himself, and then he'll wake up and he'll be fine. And this was before I started positive reinforcement, by the way. And I was like, surely he'll catch himself. Nope, fell over on my very expensive brand new custom saddle.
Oh my goodness.
That was like all of my holiday presents for that year. I was like, oh my God. And then I was like, okay, it's time to start thinking about this. And he didn't have ulcers or anything like that. And it was simple as I needed to create a positive association with saddling. And so I literally just counter conditioned it and just gave him treats for not reacting, essentially. And I will stress that this only works if the horse does not have a pain issue. because if it's pain, it's just going to be inherently a bad association. But if the horse is healthy and the tack fits and is not causing pain in any other way, then you just simply pair positive reinforcement with the saddle and the quote unquote aversive stimuli so that the horse starts to associate good things with it and expect that it predicts good things. And then I never had to use positive reinforcement with him again because he was a client horse and I wasn't supposed to, but I was like, this is the only way I think I can get him over it. And it was just as I started entering that world and started looking at the situation differently that I was like, oh. And I think that applies to riding as well. You know, if your horse is balking or spooking at something, if you just take a compassionate but inquisitive stance, you know, you're not making fun of the horse or calling him an idiot or being stupid or rude or pushy or all of the other awful labels that for some reason we love to tack onto our beloved animals. And you start looking at them as a being that has feelings and thoughts and concerns. They're prey animals. They are hardwired to be afraid at baseline. And it is our job to help them overcome those fears and become confident animals that trust us. And I think the best way to do that is by, you know, helping pair the scary or things that they don't particularly want to do with things that they really like so that it's, you know, you can mitigate some of the discomfort. And that might be like incorporating scratches or really evaluating your tack and equipment. And if your horse is refusing to line up at the mounting block or something of that nature, then maybe just don't ride for that day. Just see what's up. And then the next day, if it happens again, call the vet. Just have him looked at and see what's going on, you know? But yeah, there's just so many things that you can change about your mindset, particularly. I just find that the traditional world has such a, and I'm guilty of this as well, and it still happens frequently, and I have to catch myself and look at things differently. But there's this tendency to just tack on a personality defect and make it the horse's fault rather than, you know, something else that's affecting the horse.
Yeah.
Alrighty, guys, that is the end of episode 2. I'm sorry, cut you off right at the end there. But episode, oh God, I don't even know what number we're on at this point, but the third part in this little positive reinforcement riding series will be out next Tuesday. And in that segment, hopefully it'll be enough of a reminder that you won't feel like, you know, you've listened to these too far apart. But essentially we kind of go top to bottom on start to finish. How would you start or restart a horse with solely positive reinforcement? So I think that episode's going to be really cool. And then the episode after that is going to be answering your questions. So like I said at the beginning of this episode, if your brain isn't totally dead and you have not forgotten, just a little reminder that if you have any questions that have popped up throughout the past 2 episodes, feel free to shoot them to the EquiTheory on or Instagram, and you can just DM me, and I will see if we can incorporate those into part 4 of this series. So this is part 2. Then we'll have part 3 where we go start to finish. And then part 4 will be answering all of your questions and kind of troubleshooting. And then later on, and if some of you guys ask questions that fit this category, we'll just toss them into that episode. Me and Caine are going to do a talk about problem horses and dealing with, you know, different types of problem behaviors. And yeah, I think that that's pretty much about it. Again, if you would like to check out Caine's stuff, their website is meyerequine.com. And then you can find them on Instagram at Meyer Horsemanship. I forgot the username for a second. Oh my God. Phone call. You can check them out at Meyer Horsemanship on Instagram and keep up with them. They post a lot of really awesome things. So yeah. With that, I want to thank you guys for listening, and be sure to tune in next Tuesday and subscribe so you stay up to date. I'm brain dead, frankly, and I'm a little sick. So hopefully we're not dying. I hope that you guys enjoyed this episode and you subscribe and keep up with us. And I post on the EquiTheory Instagram and Facebook regularly, as well as Jet EquiTheory. And if you need any help with resources and finding tools to do positive reinforcement, or you want to learn more about it, my website, jetequitheory.com, has everything you need to know that I have found so far, and it is always evolving. I'm always updating it, so be sure to check in there. And with that, I'm going to let you guys go, okay? I'm going to stop rambling, and we're going to roll the music. See you next Tuesday.